And now, the Deeper Thinking Podcast, a space for ideas and reflections in our uncertain times.
Welcome to the Deeper Thinking Podcast. This essay is about how modern political power is being reshaped, not through dramatic takeover, but through subtler, ambient means: performance, fatigue, erosion of norms, and manipulation of memory. It explores how institutions adapt not by resisting, but by adjusting quietly, how fear becomes infrastructural rather than overt, how language is repurposed to signal safety instead of truth. At its core, the essay diagnoses a profound shift, from governance based on consent and clarity to one sustained by distraction, exhaustion, and emotional management. It warns that the most dangerous political condition is not tyranny, but inevitability, the idea that nothing else is possible. Yet it also gestures toward quiet resistance, in clarity of language, slowness of thought, ethical memory, and daily, unheroic acts of refusal. The essay insists that these small acts, precise speech, moral patience, bearing witness, are how civic life might still endure, even when the architecture around it seems to have been repurposed for control. Power no longer arrives in the form of declarations. It settles instead into the ordinary, reshaping the air around institutions, softening the edges of what once counted as warning signs. The transformation is not noisy, it is atmospheric. What appears to be continuity, press briefings, elections, bureaucratic process, is often choreography. Behind the performance, leverage accumulates, not just economic or military, but narrative, emotional, procedural. And the most destabilizing insight is that this accumulation does not require new tools. It uses what already exists: rules, offices, appointments, contracts, and reassigns their function from service to submission. This is not a coup. It is a retuning. Institutions still stand, but their orientation changes. They begin to look inward, to anticipate power, to avoid embarrassment. Loyalty is not demanded overtly. It is rehearsed through omission, rewarded through access. The purpose of institutions shifts from informing the public to preserving themselves. Journalism adjusts its tone. Universities reconsider speakers. Civil servants choose silence. These are not failures of courage, but symptoms of redesign. In time, resistance itself becomes suspicious, not because it is wrong, but because it is unexpected. One of the clearest insights to surface is that fear is no longer broadcast through violence, but through precedent. Not what might happen, but what already has. The quiet deportation, the unexplained dismissal, the lawsuit that doesn't need to win to drain attention and funds. These actions do not escalate, they iterate. Their power lies in the message they send to those nearby. You are visible, you are vulnerable, and you are alone. What reshapes society most powerfully is not policy, but pattern. Small choices repeated, what stories are covered, what words are used, which bureaucrats are replaced, accumulate into structure. And this structure begins to feel natural. That is the most profound danger. Not that people accept tyranny, but that they stop recognizing it. The new arrangement does not feel like rupture. It feels like adaptation, a shift in tone, a change of emphasis, a narrowing of scope. What becomes visible then is not the collapse of democracy, but its substitution. A version of democracy that retains its symbols, ballots, debates, legal reviews, but loses its responsiveness, theatre of participation where outcomes are pre-managed and narratives are pre-written. This is the insight that must be held carefully. The erosion is not chaotic, but calm. It is not enforced through fear alone, but through fatigue, familiarity, and the redefinition of what seems normal. What has emerged in this recalibrated political atmosphere is a radical reframing of threat. It no longer comes in the form of uprisings or manifestos, but instead resides in unpredictability, in the refusal to align. A whisper, a pause, a withheld endorsement, these have become legible as risk. Power, sensing the precariousness of its own legitimacy, begins to anticipate betrayal everywhere. And in doing so, it acts first. It does not wait for resistance, it preempts it, imagines it, punishes it in advance. The state, the market, the algorithm all extend their reach not through visibility but through implication. This is not a descent into overt surveillance, but a spreading of consequence. The brilliance of this system lies in its apparent restraint. It does not drag dissidents into stadiums, it questions their funding. It does not ban books, it questions their relevance. It does not silence speech, it amplifies noise. In this landscape, attention itself becomes a resource to be bought, withheld, or flooded. The shift is not toward censorship, but toward disorientation. People are not persuaded, they are exhausted. The flood of images, of warnings, of recalibrated norms creates not clarity but paralysis. In this way, control is not imposed, it is diffused. This insight is vital. Fear is no longer personal, it is infrastructural. It is built into the timetables of grant renewals, the tone of internal memos, the ambiguity of visa processes. It inhabits the bureaucratic murmur, the editorial delay, the unexplained change in protocol. It does not demand submission, but advises caution. And this caution, multiplied across thousands of desks and conversations, becomes governance. In parallel, language itself begins to shed its anchoring. Words that once held shape, freedom, security, merit, are repurposed into shells. They are repeated not to communicate, but to perform. The result is not simply propaganda, it is erosion. The ground of shared meaning begins to collapse, and in its place rises a kind of interpretive anxiety. People no longer ask only what does this mean, but who will think I meant something else. This internal audit precedes every utterance. Speech is no longer expression, it is calibration. This is not the elimination of debate, but its relocation. The debate now occurs inside individuals, silently, preemptively. The cost of public disagreement is not jail, but isolation, misinterpretation, withdrawal of opportunity. It is just high enough to persuade most people to stay close to the acceptable, and the acceptable in this system is not a consensus. It is a moving target defined not by principle, but by proximity to power. What is most revealing about this moment is not its spectacle, but its mutability. The landscape shifts constantly, not to confuse, but to wear down. What might begin as exception becomes custom. What once required justification begins to proceed by habit. The profound insight here is that the machinery of transformation is procedural, not rhetorical. Bureaucracies do not burn books, they rewrite their acquisition policies. Governments do not announce loyalty tests, they reorganize advisory committees. Compliance becomes cultural, ambient, self-sustaining. The erosion of democratic norms does not come from a single authoritarian decree. It comes from the slow retreat of accountability, the quiet marginalization of oversight. Committees are disbanded, data is withheld. Questions go unanswered long enough that they stop being asked. The state learns to avoid confrontation not by resolving conflict, but by diffusing it across enough agencies and months that no one is quite sure where responsibility lies. This is not mismanagement. It is redesign. Obfuscation becomes strategy. Institutions adapt not by defending their founding principles, but by performing relevance. In place of independence, they offer agility. In place of criticism, they offer tone. In place of leadership, they offer responsiveness to sentiment. And what sentiment rewards, especially in this moment, is strength, certainty, performance. Institutions that resist this logic begin to feel anachronistic. Those that embrace it survive, but at the cost of their function. Meanwhile, those outside formal power learn a new grammar of dissent. It is subtler, more encrypted, and often non-verbal. Protest signs become visual riddles. Editorials express defiance through omission. Acts of resistance are coded not to persuade the state, but to signal solidarity among those who remain alert. The clearest insight here is that visibility has become a trap. What survives is not what is loudest, but what is legible only to those who already know how to read it. And yet, even this recalibration of dissent carries risk. As the mechanisms of control become more interpretive, so too does enforcement. Punishment arrives not through laws broken, but through vibes perceived, a tone misread, a gesture reframed. The deeper lesson is that the border between lawful and unlawful, between safe and dangerous, between tolerated and expelled is now psychological. It exists in the mind of the administrator, the moderator, the donor, and that border moves. It moves with headlines, with sentiment, with fatigue. This instability is not a flaw, it is the system. Perhaps the most quietly radical transformation is the redefinition of coherence. Once societies held together through shared reference points, facts, traditions, institutional procedures. Now coherence itself is factional. There is no longer one consensus reality, but multiple parallel narratives, each with its own logic and proof points. The collapse is not of truth, but of recognizability. People do not just disagree, They no longer see the same world. And this fragmentation is not accidental, it is cultivated. This new condition is not simply polarization, it is saturation. Too much information, too many interpretations, too little orientation. The result is not engagement, but inertia. The impulse to act dissolves in the fog. One does not argue with fog, one waits for it to pass. And in that waiting, a new kind of quiet settles, one shaped not by peace, but by disorientation. This is the terrain in which power now operates best, a public exhausted by confusion and suspicious of its own perceptions. From this emerges a troubling inversion. The burden of proof shifts. No longer is it required of authority to explain, it is required of citizens to justify concern. To doubt becomes to deviate. To ask becomes to expose oneself. This shift reframes the moral geometry of public life. Transparency is recoded as threat. Whistleblowers are read as traitors. Leaks are not revelations but betrayals of the order. And what once would have triggered inquiry now triggers the question, whose side are you on? Even resistance begins to struggle under these conditions. Movements fracture not from outside pressure, but from the strain of maintaining coherence within. The search for ideological purity overrides strategic difference. Minor disagreements become existential. The insight here is that when the dominant political structure thrives on chaos, clarity itself becomes radical. The ability to think in ordered steps, to hold steady values, to name without spectacle, these become acts of discipline, and discipline, not outrage, becomes the most necessary political virtue. In this atmosphere, the value of slowness becomes apparent. Reflection is not indulgence, it is resistance. Nuance is not weakness, it is armor. The refusal to collapse into caricature, to flatten one's beliefs into slogans, is an insistence on one's humanity. The more politics accelerates, the more urgent it becomes to think in slower rhythms, to make space for uncertainty, to retrieve language that has not yet been weaponized. What endures in such a climate is not certainty, but a practice, the habit of noticing. Who speaks? Who is silenced? What questions go unanswered? What stories disappear? And who benefits from that disappearance? These are not gestures of paranoia, but rituals of civic attentiveness. They do not stop the erosion, but they stop us from mistaking it for weather. There is an emerging necessity to understand how agency is being redrawn, not lost, but displaced. People still act, still speak, still protest, but the context in which these actions occur has changed so significantly that their meaning and effect are altered. Participation is no longer a lever of change, it is a format. It absorbs frustration and returns little. This is not apathy. It is adaptation to a system where visibility does not equal influence and articulation does not yield action. What remains is the illusion of engagement, hollowed out from within. In this environment, strategy replaces belief. The language of values is still used, but with new inflections, not to describe ideals, but to align with imperatives. Language becomes a way of managing risk. Activists self-edit. Writers preempt objections before they appear. Leaders adopt tones rather than positions. The performative precision of modern speech, its guarded cadences, its disclaimers, its rituals of ethical distancing is not evidence of thoughtfulness, but of anxiety. And this anxiety becomes ambient, shaping not only what is said, but what is imagined possible. Commerce adapts swiftly. Market actors understand the mood and repackage discontent as style. Logos mutate. Campaigns gesture at equity. Dissent is mirrored, softened, sold. There is nothing ironic about this. Capital has always been fluent in mimicry. What is new is the speed and fluency with which it reflects political sentiment, offering not resolution, but relief. The sale of rebellion substitutes for its risks, and for many, the purchase feels adequate. This is not moral failure, it is exhaustion. Technology, once heralded as the stage for transparency and exchange, now becomes a landscape of performance and sorting. Algorithms do not prioritize the true or the urgent, they prioritize what keeps people circling. Political engagement becomes indistinguishable from attention capture. The question is no longer whether something is important, but whether it is sticky. The architecture of digital life rewards reaction, not reflection. And over time, this shift alters the texture of thought itself. We become more responsive, less deliberative, quicker to affirm, slower to reconsider. But within this distortion, moments of unscripted clarity still emerge. A phrase spoken plainly, a silence held, a refusal to escalate. These moments matter, not for their reach, but for their fidelity. They remind those watching that it is possible to inhabit language without distortion, that it is possible to resist not only what is said, but how one is made to say it. In these gestures, a different kind of politics persists, not the politics of platforms, but of presence. Not of spectacle, but of stance. And in an era defined by ambient coercion, stance is everything. A deeper consequence of this reordering is the transformation of memory. History, once a shared resource for understanding and anchoring, becomes instead a contested medium, pliable and unstable. Events are not remembered, they are reissued. Records are not preserved, they are remixed. The past is not erased, but reassembled to suit the narrative needs of the present. And so the archive itself becomes unreliable, not because it is empty, but because its curation is strategic. What is retained, elevated, or forgotten reflects not scholarship, but allegiance. This creates a fragile present. Without a stable past, orientation collapses. Continuity becomes performance. Institutions cite their own legacy while discarding its principles. Leaders evoke former crises while avoiding the responsibilities that followed them, and the public, long used to selective memory, learns to distrust all invocation of history. The result is not cynicism, but drift. The insight here is not merely that truth is contested, but that chronology itself is under strain. In such a context, political maturity becomes a function of temporal discipline, the ability to hold competing timelines in view, to resist the seduction of immediate gratification, to remain accountable not only to what has been, but to what might still be. This kind of maturity is rare because it cannot be rewarded quickly. It resists the logics of virality, of clout, of momentary resonance. But it is precisely what a functioning civic culture requires, the long patience of those who build, protect, and remember with care. Resistance, then, must begin with memory, careful, unmonetized, unperformed. Not nostalgia, which simplifies, but continuity, which clarifies. The act of remembering accurately becomes itself a political gesture. To name things as they were, to trace policies to consequences, to carry forward what was promised but not delivered. These are not acts of dwelling, but of defiance. They ground the present in something more than sentiment. This kind of defiance often appears dull. It does not trend, it doesn't satisfy the emotional tempo of the now. But it plants a stake. It says, here is what happened, here is what it meant, and here is what must follow. That orientation is quiet, but essential. Without it, every crisis becomes novelty, every injustice becomes isolated, and power benefits most when each outrage is treated as exception. What finally emerges is a kind of ethical memory, not only of what was done, but of who remained watchful. Not only of what failed, but of who refused to let failure be final. The names may not be remembered, the actions might not be recognized, but the atmosphere they protect, the small space for honesty, for clarity, for record, makes the return of accountability imaginable again. In the final movement of this transformation, the question shifts from what will happen to what will remain. Power may continue to shapeshift, to exert itself through unpredictability, performance and exhaustion, but its durability depends not on force alone, but on what people continue to accept as inevitable. And inevitability, more than ideology, is the condition most dangerous to democratic life. The insight here is clear. What people internalize as unchangeable begins to govern them long before laws are rewritten. This is not simply a warning, it is an invitation to reimagine where strength resides, not in spectacle, but in stance, not in certainty, but in clarity. The work ahead is not to outshout or outshock, but to outlast. That is its difficulty. It requires stamina without applause, discernment without recognition, action without immediate result. And these are not traits rewarded in contemporary public life. They require cultivation, solitude, and a certain willingness to be misunderstood. At the heart of this is a shift in what we mean by success. In a culture shaped by acceleration, success is often measured in visibility, reach, and resonance. But these are metrics of market logic, not civic health. A society cannot be sustained by what circulates quickly. It must be built on what holds, what steadies, what slows. The most urgent political work may be the least glamorous. Maintaining archives, defending nuance, holding space for questions that do not resolve on schedule. What begins to emerge here is not optimism, but a kind of radical patience. a refusal to abandon complexity, a commitment to tending what has not yet disappeared. This is the work of cultural trusteeship, carrying values through seasons of distortion, knowing they may not be restored quickly or in one's own lifetime. But carried they must be, because once lost, they are not easily recovered. The world ahead may not reward this kind of presence. It may continue to favour volatility, to valorise dominance, to reward those who perform most convincingly. But beneath that surface, something else persists, the quiet infrastructure of care. The unpaid labour of those who keep speaking clearly, who refuse humiliation, who witness. These are not heroes in the conventional sense. They do not win, but they do not vanish either. And that refusal to vanish, to keep language intact, to keep memory in circulation, to keep asking what might still be possible, is itself a form of power. Not the kind that governs headlines, but the kind that steadies culture. Not the kind that overthrows, but the kind that endures. Not the kind that saves everything, but the kind that keeps the world just barely inhabitable. Until next time.
You've been listening to the Deeper Thinking podcast. Today's episode was narrated by Holly, our digital narrator, who helps bring our ideas to life. For further reading, research, and ways to support the podcast, please visit the episode webpage. Thank you for your positive reviews on Apple Podcasts. Your reviews help keep us visible so others can discover and enjoy our content.